Then, we should come in and call the meeting to order. Kristen, I think you take attendance, correct?
Yep. Mr. Dunce?
Here.
Mrs. Goodman? Mr. Peterson?
Here.
Mr. Egan?
Here.
Ms. Kaminsky? Mr. Gentili? Ms. Lasky? Here.
Thank you. Everybody's had a chance, I hope, to look at the agenda. You need to make an adjustment between item 6 and item 7. We need to put in committees. So that'll change the numbers going down.
I'll make a motion to support the agenda as amended.
Second. Thank you. Moved and seconded to accept the amended agenda. In favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries. In public? Online or around?
None online.
Nope, okay. And item 5 is the approval of the minutes from last month's meeting. Any comments or changes?
A motion to approve the minute as submitted. Second that.
Moved and seconded. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries. Item 6 is treasurer's report.
Susan, do you want to lead that? You're muted.
Sorry,
There we go.
trying to get my little one to her ortho appointment today. The only thing I wanted to point out was probably, not on the accounts payable part of it, but when we get to, like the trial and balance type thing. I think the accounts payable this month is pretty straightforward. If anybody had any questions on those?
Hear none.
So if you want
I
to approve those, then we can.
Mine's the next part. I just had some concerns about the
Okay.
percentage of expenses that are coming through versus revenue right now.
Yeah, that's on the next part.
So I'll make a motion to approve the accounts payable as presented.
I'll support that.
Moved and supported. Any discussion? We have a roll call, please.
Mr. Dunce?
Yes.
Ms. Goodman? Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Egan?
Yes.
Ms. Kaminsky? Mr. Gentili?
Yes.
Ms. Lasky?
Yeah.
Motion carries. Item B, trial balance and such.
So
Susan,
on the revenue and expenditures reports, if you look at that bottom number for your year to date, it looks like there's a negative $102,000. But there's another, if you look at that Pfas grant, that reimbursement grant, we're expecting almost $81,000 back on that. So that covers almost all of that deficit that that it's showing there. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone understood that part of it. That even though it's like $102,000, it's really not, because we have almost $81,000 that will get reimbursed back for that PFAS grant.
Do we have an idea of when that's gonna come in? Because I know there's been some comments that some of these grants are running slower than usual.
So, I'll touch on that later. I've got it in my slides because there's There's actually a grant extension going on right now with regards to that, so.
And then, of course, like the insurance, we've already paid that for the year, so that's, you know, a one-time expense of almost $19,000. So that kind of covers, that deficit. Everything else, I think, is running pretty straightforward for the budget. If you take a look at, some of the things. I didn't know if anybody had any other questions on that.
I know this is on the agenda later on, and you'll probably answer this, but if the rental cars are going away, do you envision an impact to the revenue budget with that?
No, I got an update that they're not going away.
Ah.
Any other questions about the revenues and expenses and the trial balance sheet? We need to vote on accepting that, or we would just move on?
I suppose I have one small question. Utilities, there's like a $23,000 bump between January and February. I'm on the revenue and expenses sheet. Utilities is about 3/4 of the way down.
So I'll touch base on that. That's the DTE. Unfortunately, some of those bills were paid late and I had to pay a, extra money as a down payment, but I'm going to ask for that back. So that should be adjusted out. They told me that we have to pay 2 full cycles. And once that's been paid, then I can ask for that security deposit back. And that was probably about, roughly $1,000 on the 2 accounts.
And then is the other, the bump is because we paid 2 cycles at once? I'm thinking my
I'd have-
personal, you don't jump by.
Right. I'd have to take a look at how those are, but that's probably what happened.
I believe that is,
Okay.
although I will add is that February and then March is our most expensive
Yeah.
days because our gas bills
Right. Yes.
high.
Yep, okay.
And that also includes the Blarney Castle too. So, and those utilities.
Susan, do we typically book it when we pay it, or we don't accrue if the bills?
We don't
arrive?
accrue. Yeah. What's in there is truly what has been paid out. We don't do any accruals. The county doesn't do any accruals until, the end of the year. So they don't do monthly accruals. We just take a look at it at the end of the year and then accrue what we need to for September for year end.
Question? So I'll ask again, do we need to approve that or just move on?
We
Yep.
do need approval of the financial reports, so the,
Okay, then we'll need a motion for approval.
So moved. Support.
Moved and supported. Any other comment? Roll call, please.
Mr. Daunt,
Yes.
Mr. Goodman, Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Egan,
yes.
Ms. Kaminsky, Mr. Gentili,
Yes.
Ms. Lasky,
Yes.
Okay, moving on to item 7. Committees. None of the committees would have anything to report right now because none of them have met, but pursuant to some things that Barry is going to bring up later on, several of them need to meet. Probably first on priority is capital improvements, which is Mr. Egan and Ms. Lasky. So we have to coordinate between you two, Barry, and myself. You're unavailable next week, you
I'm
say?
on spring break next week, yes.
So, not next week, but the week after would be good. Is there a particular time, you guys? I'm retired, so I'm pretty flexible.
I'm the opposite of retired, so I'm fairly flexible.
Well, that's why.
Yeah.
That's pretty hardcore.
It would be the first week of April.
think that I think I'm fairly open that week, but it's, you know, the problem is Cindy and I we do contract work. And so I have to have that calendar in front of me. And it's just this patchwork of things that we do. And so, but the week of April 1st, if we're looking at just that week, then Alyssa, your schedule is probably even tighter than mine.
Is the lunch hour typically okay?
Yep.
And then how long should we plan for the
I
meeting?
think we can keep it to an hour.
Just like this one's supposed to be an hour?
No.
Okay.
This one is not going to be.
Okay. I'm good at noon on Monday, the 4th. My best day. I make Tuesday work. The rest are kinda icky, but maybe Thursday if the other two don't work.
A bit of flexibility there.
Well, I got meetings all those days, but there were people I can move them.
Monday or Tuesday is okay with me.
From noon to 1.
Yeah, yeah,
Let's plan then for Monday,
Let's try
and if
that,
Mike
yeah.
can't,
right,
email us and
Mhm.
we'll
Okay, coordinate
figure out an
through
alternative.
right,
Barry.
okay.
Okay. Then the budget committee also needs to meet because we need to start putting together a budget next year. That would be Mr. Gentili and Ms. Goodman, who is not here. So, I do that through email.
My dates, I'm out of town. I'm out of town the 30th through the 4th.
All right. And down the road a little bit, we need to assemble a bylaws committee because apparently we have some,
So I'll just kind of update on that.
Okay.
So our bylaws currently state that, board attendance via electronic means is allowed. And that's been in our bylaws since, I think, the 2014 or 2012 update. Some of the, little bit of history there is the state Open Meetings Act was kind of quiet on whether electronic attendance was allowed or not. A court opinion basically said it was okay. So until, COVID, public entities could allow electronic participation. In COVID, everything became electronic, so they changed all the rules. And then as COVID ended, they restricted all the rules, but they restricted it explicitly to not allow electronic participation with a couple corner exceptions. As of January 1st, our bylaws do not align with the state statutes around the Open Meetings Act. We need to bring our bylaws into agreement with.
it'd be a very big deal, I wouldn't think, would it?
No, that changed the
Changes
bylaws
some
is minor,
language,
but
yeah.
it would make sense to also review all the bylaws and just see if there are any other updates
Right.
that would be appropriate to make at the same time.
Is there any way to change it rather than making a hard, fast rule that you can't do it, to just correlate it to whatever the state law
That
allows? That
would
way,
be-
if they
it's like-
change it back, you don't have to worry
We
about
would
changing.
allow it if it were allowed under state statute. So
Just
that we
avoid
don't.
having to change it again.
Right.
Anybody present have a particular interest in participating in that committee?
I don't know, I contacted Barry in regard to that because of what I found when I scheduled I was out in Arizona and I couldn't participate via electronic, which I thought I was going to be able to chair the meeting from a
Mhm.
remote location, come to find out I can't even speak.
Mm.
How'd that go for you?
That was tough. But at any rate, that one piece needs to be, you know, set to whatever current state law is.
Was that a volunteering or just a point of interest?
Point of interest, I'm not a really good bylaw kind of,
All right.
I'll tell you that.
Well, we'll address that down the road a little bit then. So we'll move on to, item 8, Area's Airport Director's Report.
Okay. Yes, so yeah, one of each of those.
This way.
Thank you.
Okay,
Size of these stacks, isn't it?
so,
Yeah.
actually, if you could pass one of each of the other documents around as well. So there are no incidents or accidents to report, having occurred in the last month. I've got a slide on this later, and a lot of my content is coming from the State Airport Conference that I attended Wednesday and Thursday, mid-February, just after our last meeting. On the car rental front, so it's also on the agenda under new business, but I'll give kind of the background here. So I have reached out and had a positive response from Victorian Carport. So they are lined up to be providing rental cars at the airport beginning May 1st. Their goal is to actually ramp up to a total of 10 vehicles this summer. Since we've had 6 vehicles, that's actually an increase in capacity. And for the first time in a long time, at least some of those vehicles are going to be brand new vehicles. It's cheaper right now in some ways to buy a new vehicle than it is to buy a used vehicle for the value of it. So that's what's that's what's in line right now. Later on the agenda, and one of the things that was just passed around is our basically sample rental car concessionaire agreement. And I'm basically going to be asking for the board to authorize me to basically execute that with Victorian Carport. The reason it's not filled in today is Craig is planning on setting up a different entity, and I don't know the name of the entity that it's actually going to be operating under. But I don't want to wait until next month to get this done, so I'm basically going to ask for approval to authorize me to execute that with our new vendor. So that's good news. One consequence, though, is expect the rates of rental cars out of Manistee to be much higher than they have been with the type of vehicles, and also just the rental market. I mean, our rates have been the same for the last 10 years and haven't gone up. They're going to go up significantly as a result of this change. But that's also what you see out of Traverse City and other places as well. So, since our airport revenues are based on a percentage of gross receipts, that actually should be a positive revenue impact for us.
I'm just curious, what does substantially mean? I don't have any idea what they were.
Right now, they've ranged between 50 and 65 a day, and it'll probably be more around 90 a day, to maybe 100 for an SUV type vehicle.
What you'd expect anywhere else? Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So,
If you can get one.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't
So-
think anybody using them will be too surprised.
People flying into Manistee who've done it for 20 years are
Oh, yeah.
shocked by any change.
Well-
What?
Yeah.
So,
Barry, how many cars you say they're gonna have?
and Greg's goal is 10.
You currently had 6.
Yes.
You think he's gonna be able to get more SUVs or larger size for the golfers, or you don't know?
He's working on that. I mean, he's going to the auctions and trying to find what he can that, the right mix for the needs. And that is one of the details that he and I need to work out is, since he's going to be handling the reservation aspect of it, how we make sure that we have inventory for our general aviation flights, golf clubs, et cetera, because there's enough demand in the summer that the airline would use every vehicle we had. And when my staff was managing it, we basically reserved some vehicles that couldn't be used for the airline unless it was like a day of type or day before reservation. How we do that with Greg handling, things down the road, we'll figure it out, but, have the right mix and then making sure. Because from a revenue standpoint, a jet coming into the airport brings in a lot more airport revenue than a single passenger on the airline. Both are important, but, you know, that jet diverts to a different airport because they can't get a car. That's a bigger revenue hit.
Would there be a link on the airport's website to theirs, or they're
Yes.
just gonna get referred?
Yep, yes. Yep. Okay, looking at the passenger numbers for February, and then the, Cape Air's performance for February. So we'll see here that, for the month of February, we had 440 total passengers, about a 10% increase versus February a year ago, and is the best we've had since back to 2017, when we had 474. So overall, from a passenger's perspective, Cape Air is performing well. Their continued issue is still on, performance. 16% of the flights were canceled. For February, those were mostly weather, related, and specifically wind in Chicago O'Hare, preventing them from getting into the currently open, O'Hare runway. I've mentioned this before, is the predominant runways in O'Hare are east-west. If there's a strong north or south wind, Cape Air's smaller aircraft aren't able to land, on the east-west runway. They need the north-south runway open. Those rarely get opened unless things are really bad down there. They have been and continue to work on an alternate plan. They're working right now with FAA approval on this, that they would divert and technically schedule flights in Chicago Executive Airport instead of canceling, and then bus people the 15 minutes or 10 minutes from Chicago Executive over to O'Hare. So at least people are getting their flights, occurring, even if there will be, you know, a delay, maybe an hour and a half. But that is better than the current situation where we can have entire day's flights canceled because aren't allowed to operate into the currently active O'Hare runway.
What were other reasons for canceling? I know it was mostly.
That was mostly it. I'm gonna, so in March, and this doesn't cover March since we're only, almost 2/3 of the way through. For March, it's been pilot shortage, and I'm gonna go into great detail on pilot shortage because it's a industry-wide issue, and it's potentially gonna impact us in unforeseen ways, going forward.
And that was gonna be my question, is I know these numbers look bad compared to historic numbers, but as somebody that flies every 3 weeks, I'm just wondering how does this compare to everybody else? I can tell you, I spent 7 hours in Chicago the last couple times I've flown just because of pilot shortage, crew shortage.
Yep.
People not being in the right
Yep.
places.
Yeah. It impacts us more because we get a days, or in one case, a week ago, 3.5 days of flights were canceled. Because there was no crew to fill that slot of 3.5 days of service. Yesterday, we had, my monthly call with Andrew Bonney was this morning, and we do now have crews allocated to us for basically the rest of the spring schedule. So we should not see this happening as we now have a permanent allocation of crews until we switch to the summer schedule where we double the number of flights, and therefore we will need crews to fulfill that need. Now, that doesn't mean we won't have a flight canceled because of lack of crew, because of sickness or other things. I mean, there's no capacity right now to backfill if those types of things come up. But yesterday should have been the last time that we will see these full day type cancellations. So March will not show an improvement versus February, and we had been incrementally improving a little bit from kind of the low point back in November. The good thing is, and to give Cape Air some credit, is their mechanical issues with the TechNIMs, those have basically all been addressed. We haven't had a cancellation because of a mechanical reason for a long time now. We've got spare aircraft here, maintenance is doing what they're supposed to be doing. So that cause, which was a significant cause through the fall, has been addressed. These weather issues are somewhat seasonal. We tend to get those strong southerly winds or northerly winds as seasons change, so kind of a fall event or a spring event. Generally, once we get to the summer, we don't have those big fronts that have those really powerful storms. Winds come up and, give us 60-degree days one day and then, 20 the next type thing. So, things aren't where they need to be, but I'm feeling cautiously optimistic that the worst is behind us.
This time of year, how many planned flights are there a month, about, give or take?
There's two round trips a day, so 4 total flights a day. Okay, any questions on that? And I will move on to airfares. So here, nothing too unusual that we're seeing on the airfare front. Traverse City, while they were very competitive last summer, as every one of the carriers threw lots of added capacity into Traverse City, kind of the first post-pandemic summer, they were really focusing on leisure travelers, and Traverse City fits that bill to a T. They, in some ways, probably over-committed capacity, and, that led to depressed prices as a result. What we're seeing now is kind of more historic norms, where Traverse City is, the most expensive of the 4 airports I track, Muskegon being second, us being third, and then Grand Rapids with basically the most kind of competition there for passengers and the most capacity being the least expensive. Everything adjusted a little bit last month. Everything's gone up, and again, we will expect to see that as we come out of winter, the slowest months of the year for air travel, into summer, that all of these fares will just keep rising. I'm most interested in where we, compare to other airports as opposed to what the absolute fare level is, especially with fuel prices going up and everything, you know, so many things that will drive prices higher this summer. But that delta between us and Grand Rapids is small enough that when you include, you know, kind of other factors like in this case parking or, you know, just value of your time to drive down there and back, you know, we still are a relatively good comparison to airfares out of Grand Rapids, as long as the flights are operating as they need to be.
I'd be curious, I don't wanna, it's not worth spending time on now. I'd be curious though, like we think about value of time driving somewhere, I avoid like the plague having a layover flight.
Mm-hmm.
How many, like going out of Grand Rapids to get to one of these places, do we know on average how many more jumps someone would have to take leaving our airport versus one of those airports?
For these, it's probably similar.
Okay,
Just because these are the lowest fares.
yeah, okay.
And generally, you're gonna find, not always, sometimes the nonstops are the lowest fare because just from an operating cost perspective, it is the least expensive way to do it. But generally, they're pricing things as, oh, we got extra capacity through this one, so we'll,
Okay.
you know, make it at a discount. So generally, most of those Grand Rapids will be one-stops as well, although certainly some of them are non-stops,
Okay.
especially.
But like your findings, more or less, that's like a negligible component of this, like if we're comparing these, that's a variable that probably it's multiple stops out of here, probably out of there.
Well, for us, it's always gonna be multiple stops.
Right, so that's why I'm looking at that,
Chicago.
yeah.
Depends on where you're going. Like, when I used to have to go to Denver every couple of weeks, I could get a nonstop out of Grand Rapids for half the price
Yeah.
from here.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I would just drive down.
Right,
Right,
because
But
you've
now
got
I gotta go to
Frontier,
Nashville,
you've
nobody
got-
flies directly to Nashville. And the prices were getting to the point where they were beginning competitive to where I was gonna start going to Traverse City. But in the last couple of months, Traverse City is 3 times the price of Grand Rapids for a flight to Nashville.
okay.
So I still drive down to Grand Rapids.
Mhm.
United, I don't know what happened, but they went, in the last 2 months, they've just skyrocketed. And they even tried Delta, and they were, ever since December, the prices out of Traverse City to get to Nashville, because it's, again, they've got to stop in Chicago too. They're just insane.
Any other questions? Okay, then, moving on to my next slide, no update on the law enforcement coverage yet. Sheriff Kowski's in my mail to you, and I've been ignoring him, so I need to get on to that.
Not good to ignore the sheriff. Just saying.
We had talked briefly about this last month, and I had intended this month to go into more detail, but given all the other things that have come up, I wanted to postpone this until a future meeting to talk really about what our next steps are with zoning. T-Hanger, the electrical meter changes project, the contractor tells me that they are coordinated with consumers now for an April sometime, project completion. So, next is, so I had mentioned that I was at the state, airport conference, this was our second in-person conference, the fall one was also in person as well. But there was actually a lot of good content being covered there. And some of it is going to be into, longer discussions. But, some updates on kind of our, I'll call them mini grants, based on the various tranches of recovery dollars that, got approved over the last couple of years. No update on when we will receive the $13,000 from round 2. The round 3, which is the final tranche, and our allocation is $32,000 for that. The state isn't even planning to issue the grants for that until January of next year. So they're just intentionally spreading these funds over a longer period of time to reduce primarily their workload, because normally MDOT does 1 grant per year per airport. The last couple of years, they've had to do 2 or 3 grants per airport because of all of these additional funding sources, and that's going to be continuing for probably the next 5 years for them, given the way some of these programs are being structured. So, you know, we will get that money. It's just, I was anticipating it was gonna be this fiscal year, that $32,000, but it's clearly now gonna be next fiscal year. There were actually multiple sessions on the topic of electric/autonomous aircraft, and the industry is pouring tons of money into these type of new aircraft. There's a belief that these new types of aircraft will dramatically change air service, air travel, in the future. Interesting things about them is often they don't technically even need airports because they're vertical takeoff and landing type aircraft. You know, think of, you know, your little drone, but on steroids, and it carries 7 people. Ultimately, a lot of that is being targeted at high-density population areas where historically maybe helicopters were a thing, but the cost-benefit of helicopter travel just never really materialized. They believe that with newer technology, that can work. But the reality is the last environment that the FAA is ever going to approve these things is high-density areas. First places that these are likely to be seen will be in rural, remote areas, not unlike ours. And there is some talk beginning to occur that maybe EAS airports are an ideal candidate to be adopting newer technology in an effort to try to reduce costs and try to basically embrace, some of these changes. So some of these manufacturers have aggressive timelines on the order of within the next 24 months. The FAA, there's no way the FAA and the bureaucracy of the FAA will move fast enough to make that possible. But it's a case where technology may be driving the bureaucracy to get their act together, because entirely new ways of thinking need to happen, need to occur if these are really autonomous vehicles. You don't even have a pilot. What does all that mean? Or it's remotely piloted from, someone sitting in a terminal, 100 miles away type thing.
Yeah, I can just see the FAA jumping right on that.
But I mean, it's interesting. Again, there are multiple sessions, some from actually manufacturers of these types of equipment, the FAA spent an entire session talking about the state of this. So everyone believes it's coming. No one's really sure what it's going to look like.
So were they describing something that would have 3 or 4 people in it, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Because the problem with these things, one of the problems is the power curve. On an electric engine, the normal aircraft relies on that fuel weight going down as it goes, but an electric airplane is just as heavy on each end.
Yep.
And that's one of the things they haven't been able to mathematically shake out yet. So.
And there are versions on the autonomous side that are conventionally powered, not electric, because they're they're focusing more on that issue as
Yeah.
opposed to the electric, but then there are other, entities approaching it from the electrification side, so there's probably 15 different manufacturers right now that are in this space. And for aircraft, that's like unheard of, that there are that many of anything trying to innovate.
So what do
That
they,
hasn't happened since in 100 years.
so are they, for an EAS airport like ours, they're not talking about actually being able to take somebody to Chicago in one of those things, are they?
Not on electric, but, well, probably our distance would probably be too far.
Yeah.
But no, they are. I mean,
Okay.
in Cape Air, because Cape Air is a large enough 9-seat small aircraft company with a lot of different types of routes,
Mm-hmm.
every one of these manufacturers has approached Cape Air and wants them to be their pilot, operator for their
Wow.
aircraft.
Wow.
To the point that Cape Air is now providing consulting services to them to say what it would take. Because
Yeah.
they were spending a lot of their time just answering questions, and it's like, well, no, we're gonna charge you for that.
What type of elevation are they talking?
What?
How high elevation are they looking to fly in?
I don't know on that. I would expect it to be non-pressurized, so under 10,000 feet. So, fascinating, but not necessarily immediately relevant to us. But I think it would be beneficial for us to make sure that we're aware of this, because I think there are potentially economic development, business opportunities in this space, because there's a lot of dollars being poured into it. And if we can find the right niche, I think we could maybe attract something that could help us. The next thing is unleaded avgas. So aviation gasoline is the last fuel that is produced that still contains lead.
Mm-hmm.
And recently, there has been some high-profile things going on in Reed Hillview, which is, I think it's the San Jose, California airport,
I read that article.
where the board basically outlawed the sale of leaded fuels on airport property. And GA Airport, with 100-some small piston aircraft that use that fuel, and now they can't actually buy fuel. There's some of the background there is the value of land in that area is so significant, is that there are a lot of people that would just love the airport not to be there. So and this may be part of the motivation, and using environmental issues as a reason to justify ultimately the airport having to close because using it anymore because they can't buy fuel. But what is, interesting is that there are now unleaded alternatives finally emerging in the marketplace. The issue, though, is compatibility with aircraft that span from the 1940s that are still operating to aircraft being produced today with, turbocharged engines versus, all sorts of things. So there's a really wide range of use cases. Each one of those potentially has to be recertified to use any different type of fuel. That process is actually ongoing, and there are 2 competing fuels out there that are kind of in this space, and it looks like one of them may actually have what it takes to get across the finish line. Where this will ultimately happen soon, it is believed, is up until this point, the EPA has not they've been quiet on this topic. It is expected that probably this year, if not within the next couple of months, the EPA is going to issue some sort of technical thing that basically will outlaw, avgas at a certain date. Will then force everything to now start to speed up. Because they believe that there's enough momentum and capacity of these fuels that are in the pipeline to, with a little pressure from a regulatory standpoint, to actually finally make that change. So that will obviously impact us, but hopefully not in any significant way. It should just be a clean cutover. The worst case scenario that everyone is trying to avoid is airports needing to have capacity to provide both fuels, because we have to basically add a whole other part of our fuel farm to offer a third fuel. So that is a little bit there. That's the most progress I've heard and the most kind of encouraging, and at the same time makes me nervous, because once the EPA gets involved, then it starts, what if some hiccups occur in certification and now it can't happen on their timeline? Will the EPA be flexible enough, or will they just not care if it costs airports, $50,000 each to implement multiple fuels or something? Next is the bipartisan infrastructure law, and specifically the airport funding part of that nearly $1 trillion bill. There is $25 billion of that funding that's allocated to airports, $5 billion a year for the next 5 years. And it was very enlightening as to how that is being allocated and to be used by airports, and I have a whole slide later to talk about that. The other thing is that TSA in the air carrier meeting, so the air carrier airports, we have our own kind of session where we just talk about air carrier type things. TSA presented in that. There are changes that are occurring, and we're likely to be on the short end of those changes, it was interesting to sit through. And again, I've got more on that coming up. So it was actually one of the most there was more information in this conference than I've probably gotten out of any conference I've been to. It just kind of all coming together. Next, just some quick updates on where we are with existing projects. So our airport layout plan update. I met with Prina Newhoff and kind of gave them my feedback on the part of the draft that I've been given access to. And we ended up talking about a lot of other things that up in this presentation. I still don't have a full copy of the draft. They are incorporating my existing feedback in, and so it just seems to be slowly occurring, but they've had a lot of employee turnover within Prina Newhoff, so, and it's actually something that also came up at the conference, but our principal consultant that has been working with us now for 6-7 years, Bob Nelson, he has resigned from Prina Newhoff. He got hired by the Traverse City Airport, so he is their airport engineer. So he's happy because he no longer needs to travel, and he's in his backyard. And then the lady who was actually working mostly on this ALP for us, Stephanie Green, she went and left and is working at a competitor consulting firm with more opportunities for her than Prina Newhoff. One of the things that came out of the conference is that every consulting firm out there is short on workers, employees, and everyone is hiring. And no one knows, with essentially a doubling of funding for projects, where the capacity to do those projects is going to come from, overall staffing perspective. One of my sons is currently up at Michigan Tech and planning on going into civil engineering, and I sort of told him, it's like, you timed this right. There's gonna be some good job opportunities when you get out of school. Because, we're dealing with, for airports, a 5-year funding, but a 10 years to use that funding. So for the next 10 years, there's gonna be a lot more demand for employees in this space, and that doesn't even talk about roads and all of the other things that are also getting significant amounts. What will probably happen is the cost of everything will double, and we'll just get the same amount of work done with twice the amount of money. Pfas testing. So this was mentioned earlier. So after the last board meeting, we had a review meeting with Eagle and MDOT on the results of our phase 2 work, and naturally Eagle wanted more work to be done. And there's no way for the consultant to get that work done by the existing end of the grant, which was essentially now, or within a couple weeks of now. So we applied for and received a grant extension for 4 months until the end of July. So the follow-up work was possibly scheduled for next week, but since I'm not going to be here next week because of spring break, I asked that they move it to a time I was going to be here. So I don't yet know, but that should actually happen soon. And then getting those testing results, and then we should be able to get that submitted for final grant reimbursement and close out, anticipating well before that July date, but need to carry that balance for a couple more months as we are working through these final things on that grant.
So the ALP,
Yes.
I'm just trying to orient myself to
Yep.
these different things. Is that covered under, that work is covered under the grant? Is that the PFAS grant? Like if I look at this, or those
No.
two separate things?
Those
We just
two
work with
separate
them? Okay.
Yep. So the ALP update is grant paid for,
It is, okay.
but it's part of our annual allocation of $150,000 that is paying for that project from 2020.
When we originally started that, how long did we expect the project to go?
I was expecting it to be done by October 1st of last year. So it has definitely gone long.
Do you happen to know how much of the grant's been used?
Of the ALP, they're sitting at probably about 95% of that being completed. Again, we're at the phase right now of, there's a document that they have that's a 200-page document, and
Like it's almost wrapped up?
it's almost wrapped up, yes. It's just, with their staffing turnover, they're having a hard time actually wrapping it up because the person working on it is no longer there.
So I work in consulting, and when we have turnover, guess whose problem it isn't? Our customers, my clients. I'm curious how they're able to use that as a reason for their delays.
There's no deadline on this. So this is a necessary component to do future projects. So this is basically our planning document, and it is out of date, and basically the state and the feds say, well, we're not gonna fund any projects until you have this update.
Oh, I get it, it's important.
Right. So until we get into a cycle where we're working on new projects, they're not losing future revenue, they're just not completing it. So, yes, I hear you. It's, yes. Well, actually, one thing I will add to that, somewhat a tangent, but I'm starting the process, is every 5 years, the FAA requires that we go out and do a consultant selection, and we are at the point in time where this is the year we need to do that. So we will be looking at what's out available, and that may come into the decision process. Cape Air service update, I think I've probably covered everything on the slide when we were back on the numbers spreadsheet, so I'll skip that. I will, though, mention is our advanced bookings are actually very strong right now for spring and into summer. For July, we've already probably sold 15% of the total seats that we will operate in July, and we're in mid-March. We, last week, sold as many seats as the top weeks of sales basically on any year in the past, and again, that's the mid-March sales where we generally don't see that volume until May.
And I think that's changed because, I'm booked out a lot further out than I usually am, just because I know the prices are just going to keep going up.
Yeah.
So I've already booked my next 3 flights. As long as I know my kid's schedule, I'm booking it right now, just to try and get the price as cheap as possible.
Right.
So, just something that's, it's on the more positive side than focusing on all the negative issues with Cape Air right now. So I touched on this earlier. As of January 1st, so prior to January 1st, the state of Michigan and its TSA airports were divided into 2 regions. One was based out of Grand Rapids and the other out of Detroit. And Grand Rapids had basically Western Michigan, all VUP, so they actually had the majority of the airports, albeit the smaller ones. And then Detroit basically had the eastern part of the state, basically just southeastern, so they had like 3 or 4 airports that were under Detroit. The Federal Security Director of the Grand Rapids region retired, and as a result, they basically consolidated, so now there is one region that covers all of Michigan, so all 18 airports report into the Detroit Federal Security Director. He's relatively new to the position, and he presented at the conference, and like airports having access to money as a result of federal stimulus, TSA has access to money. So one of his goals in taking over all of Michigan is to standardize technology across every airport in Michigan, which means we are now slated to get a new X-ray machine as the first component of that, even though ours is relatively new. And the new one is bigger than the old one, and it barely fits in the space. In fact, they have to angle it about 5 degrees to give them a couple more inches so that they've got the right clearances around certain things. We've also been told, and there's been an advanced crew out here looking into electrical needs of this, but we're going to be getting a baggage scanner. So if you're familiar with some of the airports that still have those kind of out in the public space, they're about a 25-foot long thing, and bags go in one end, and they get screened automatically. Here, based on 9 passengers a flight, all the baggage is manually manually reviewed as opposed to going through a scanner. fact, it was interesting, at his presentation at the conference, he actually used this as one, can you believe that there are airports out there that still hand screen luggage? And I'm like, and it makes complete sense when you've only got 8 people on a flight and maybe 8 bags, as opposed to a $600,000 piece of equipment. And then the final component will be a full body scanner, which is kind of the standard person scanning technology now. Our issue is a lack of space for any of this. The terminal was not built to accommodate these types of things. And while TSA is more than happy to spend lots of money on their equipment, it becomes our responsibility to deal with making it fit. So, I've starting to push back, and basically, the X-ray machine will fit, even though it will look a little bit weird being slightly on an angle. The baggage scanner could fit if I kicked the airline out of their space. There's a back room back there, and it's actually the airline is the one that leases it, but it's where TSA does their baggage screening. If we kick the airline out, we could accommodate it in there, but I'm basically pushing back and saying, no, it won't fit, because the airline has to have space as well. Full body scanner, TSA is saying, well, if we take down this wall and take down this wall, we can just, you don't need space for people to sit and visit. But that's partly the way they think is, accommodate, from a security and safety standpoint, it trumps everything, so convenience is not important. So that's generating some interesting things coming. In addition, this terminal, when it was built, we had Great Lakes Airlines and we were operating a 19-seat aircraft, such that in our holding area post-screening, there are 19 seats. That's what that area was designed to hold. There realistically is no baggage return area in the terminal. What was designed when the terminal was built never worked, so it's been pulled out. And when you're dealing with a 9-passenger aircraft, you can make anything work. But if we ever were to have, more than 19 seats, could attract a regional jet, which until 2 weeks ago, I was thinking was there was a possibility that that could occur. We'd basically be in an issue where, we would be struggling in past capacity for the way this terminal is designed. So, all of those issues are pointing to issues in the terminal, plus there are some features of the terminal that are aging and needing replacement anyway, just because, we're now 15 years old and 20 years will be around the corner. So that turns me back to the bipartisan infrastructure law. So the $15 billion per year over each of the next 5 years, because we don't have 10,000 employments, we get less money, but we do get $159,000 per year. So it basically doubles our allotment that we've been getting, which is $150,000. I had known that this was going to be the amount we were going to get. My assumption was that the requirements for these dollars would be the same as our existing $150,000, which basically is have to use it on the most important projects that's out there based on the FAA's scoring system of what's important. So generally, pavement and runways and safety and security, those types of things take precedent over anything that may be lower priority but may help the airport in other ways. what was very enlightening in the presentations by both the FAA and the state is they do not desire to force that requirement on these additional dollars. They want airports to spend them on things that potentially would never get done otherwise. So that completely changed how I was looking at things. And in addition to, or that $159,000 that we're going to get per year, there is, of the $5 billion, $1 billion is targeted at terminal improvements. So, you can kind of see where some of this is going. And naturally, or I would say not naturally, but this is now all happening fast, which is surprising because usually the FAA and the feds don't move fast. But, you know, we were presented this information in mid-February, and we needed to submit an updated airport capital improvement plan by March 11th to tell the FAA how we were intending to use our additional allocation of $159,000. So after working with Pri and Newhoff on that, here is what we have submitted to the FAA and the state. So using this year's funding, a terminal study, which would basically round out kind of these needs into a formal document that can then be turned into a terminal project. And replacing half of our aging T-hanger door issue. So this project that the airport has been struggling to fund for years, we've split it over 2 years, but we can get the doors replaced, and that is likely $100,000. Well, now that we've got a consulting firm and engineering and everything, the cost is going up, but still it's being covered under these grant dollars. We can get that done. What's left for then us to do with our funding is basically get that roof painted, patched, and then any other touch-ups that might need to be done. The big chunk of that project is now submitted for this. And as far as I know, we're a go to do it. I mean, we had our meeting with our state consultant on this, and it's been submitted. So that first year, that we should essentially be approved. And sometime this summer, get grants to do those projects. Next year's funding, finishing the T-hanger doors, and then replacing our airport beacon. Our airport beacon actually right now is not functioning. The motor burned out, and Topline Electric has been out here, verified that that was the issue. The owner there has had carpal tunnel surgery, so he's recovering before he's going to be climbing up that tower again. It's not going to be inexpensive. It's probably going to be about a $2,000 replacement, but that beacon is probably 50 years old. And it's off and on been on our improvement plan, but it's always been such a low priority that it's getting pushed back. This is an opportunity to get it done. And a new one, they're much smaller. They're on a tilt-up tower, so you don't have to climb. You can just basically tilt it down, do whatever maintenance you need, and back up. It'll be a lot better for us in the long run, and it should have a lifespan that, you know, outlasts me. And then finally, looking at the remaining 3 years of this funding, basically pulling it together to basically buy a new snowplow. Our current new snowplow is now 2006, so that's 16 years old. Our old snowplow is a 99, so that's 23 years old. This is another one of those items that has been just, you know, it's always out there. Well, it's on our plan was 10 years out, and staying 10 years out. We're going to start having significant maintenance issues, and we saw a couple things, this winter occur on that snowplow that we need to take the opportunity to get that replaced, because one of the most important things we have in the winter to keep our air service going.
So these three items, those, I'm so sorry, I'm trying to keep in my head
Yep.
straight with all these grants and fundings,
Yes.
which is going where. So these are, the three bullets are using the additional 159 a year? Okay,
Over the,
got it.
over the 5 years.
Got it.
Then, the terminal improvement piece of the overall funding, requests need to be submitted by the end of this month. And our plan is to submit a request for about a $2 million project, even though at this point we have no idea what it would be. Primarily, just we want our name on the list, even though we're not expecting to receive funding this year because we don't have a clear enough plan yet. But doing the terminal study should allow us in year 2 to have a much better ask, and then there's still 3 more years after that if we don't get funding. One of the nice things about this terminal money is the way the funding is allocated. There are certain percentages that go to large airports, medium-sized airports, small airports. But for all of the bigger airports than us, all of those allocations are that amount not to exceed. For the small airports, it's an allocation that must be no less than. So we're in a position where if we can justify, and I'm hoping that the TSA stuff gives us that justification, that the dollars will be there. Matter of making sure that there's enough to go around for everybody that's going to be wanting to do terminal projects. So,
Are all
that-
the bigger airports that are doing work now, are they using CARES funding, or, because every airport I go to right now seems to be under construction?
they are most likely, yes, using CARES funding or one of the subsequent rounds of funding, because in the city, they had like $50 million total of funding through that. But, I mean, Traverse City, they are starting, or they actually started well over a year ago now, a plan for a terminal expansion that's basically gonna double the size of their terminal up there, and they're jumping all over this as how to fund it.
That's where our PNN consultant went to work on that full-time?
That is one of the reasons they're hiring a full-time, engineer up there. They're looking at some major projects. So that kind of ties up funding. One other thing I will mention is a email came out a week or more ago from Senator Peters' office. In the current congressional climate, earmarks are back. So he basically put out a broad request if there are any constituents who think of projects that would make sense for his office to request an earmark funding for. At this point, I don't see us having that need, given what we've got going on. I don't think we can necessarily do more, and our hangar project is, I think, mostly covered in this. But I will mention that's something that should come up every year, at least until Congress changes the rules and bans earmarks again. But that's currently also something that we can pursue through the political channels for additional funding if it makes sense.
I mean, is something like the beacon or the snow plows, I know that those could be part of the $159,000 funding, but we say, yeah, get this on your list, and then we can reallocate those dollars in future years?
We could, yes.
Because what the worst he's gonna say is, we'll say, get it on your list, and he says, sorry, I couldn't do anything, in which case we already have a great plan for it.
We could do that, yep.
I mean, does it hurt?
And that's one of the reasons why our committee
Yeah.
needs to meet, is to be
Okay.
talking about how we wanna strategize some of these things.
How much is the new beacon?
I wanna say $80,000.
Everything, the tower and all?
Yeah. And Newhoff just did one for, I think, 55,000, but they're expecting with inflation that it's gonna be 80.
Probably cheaper to do maintenance on those and everything, huh?
My
Especially,
list for a long time has been 1,000-foot runway, in addition,
Right.
along with, a hangar that you could put a regional jet in.
so, the runway, the challenge there is, we've got about $8 million worth of taxiway improvements over the next 4 years. We couldn't do that until after that project is completed. There's just not, we couldn't close the runway, it would be too much, and then having two different funding sources, and it just doesn't make sense to pursue that until that is, probably a year from being completed would be when we would start pursuing that. However, the, larger community or corporate hangar, that would be something that would definitely be a possibility.
Any matching funds involved with any of these big things coming?
I'm gonna touch on that.
Okay.
And actually that is, so, one of the things that should have got handed out is a one-pager that looks at, basically, this is taking the last version of this that the board had seen, updated it and adjusted it for all of these changes, and adjusted a few things where they needed to get moved around. But the big part about this is the bottom line here is basically where we are short on funding to accomplish this. Now, most of this now comes down to is, even though our matching percentage is 2.5%, although for some of these, it's gonna be double that, 5%, because the state hadn't budgeted for their 2.5% share, so we get to cover the whole 5%, for these additional, revenue streams that are coming in play. But when we're spending potentially over the next 5 years, $10 million, 2.5%, on most of it, with some of it being 5%, that's $250,000 to $300,000 of matching dollars we're going to need, to just do all of the infrastructure work that's coming. So, Jeff, question for you. When I talked to Lisa Segala last, which was about 2 weeks ago, she said that last week there was gonna be a form that was gonna be put out.
There's a
and
draft.
I didn't see the form come out yet, so.
It's a draft, it's not, I don't believe it's finalized.
Okay. Per the board's direction last month, I had emailed Lisa with, here are some items that the county could possibly consider with their funding. I added to that list just the match for our projects, because I don't know where we're going to receive these, where we're gonna get the dollars to be able to pay for the match of $10 million in capital projects. And when I presented to the county commissioners as part of their budget process last year and kind of shared some of this, I raised this at that point that, you know, the airport is gonna have some funding shortfalls as we look through these years, primarily driven by, some of these larger projects. So, just so you know, understand what that is, and again, like, this is really mostly gonna be input into the Capital Projects Committee and then come back to the board, if there are any changes at the committee level. Any other questions? Thank you for reminding me on that.
So what's the difference between item 14 and item 21?
There isn't a difference. That reflects where it used to be on our plan, and then it got moved up, to a different location because it was using a different funding stream, and then it moved from.
So under this new funding stream, back to Barry's question, and we're assuming it's gonna be a 5%?
Yes.
At 4,900 versus the 2,000?
That is what the state is telling us to expect. The state may allocate some of their funding to increase their allocation for grant matches as well, but they have not yet done that.
Based off of that explanation, then wouldn't 23 have to be moved up as well?
No, that is actually where that comes in, because we're using 3 years of funding pooled together to pay for it. So fiscal year 26, 27, so that corresponds to that.
526?
Any other questions? Okay, then I'm going to move on to a very different topic, but one that is also very much up in the air right now. So, last month, we were talking about essential air service and kind of our scoring criteria, and I kind of gave a little bit of overview of how that process works. We'll see more during the course of this year. A lot is happening in the space of the essential air service space right now. And the most dramatic thing occurred just over a week ago, where SkyWest Airlines, who currently, they provide service to about half of the essential air service communities in the lower 48 states. So there's roughly 100 airports in the lower 48 that have essential air service. There's probably another 50 in Alaska, but their version of service is so different from what we see.
They have to have, they just function.
Yes, yeah, but I mean, their service is with small aircraft because, you know, it's really to a community that's only got 100 people. I mean, it's a very different type of environment. And then Hawaii's got a little bit on some of the more remote islands as well. But in the lower 48, SkyWest was servicing about half of the airports. And that has significantly increased over the last 5 years, but you know, during COVID, they bid and won a lot of new service because they had planes sitting not being used, and they had pilots sitting not being used. Well, a year later, everything is different, and now we're in a pilot shortage. So on Wednesday the 9th, they gave notice to DOT that they are stopping service at 29 of their markets. And I've got a slide here. So basically, each one of those dots, with the exception of the dots that are airport hubs like O'Hare and Denver, those are the markets that they are pulling out of essentially, they gave a 90-day notice. Two airports in Michigan, Houghton and Muskegon, Decatur, Illinois, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, not a lot in the Midwest, a lot around Denver, some on the East Coast. What's a little bit interesting, and I don't know the reason for this, is all of the markets they're pulling out of are markets they served under the United brand. Anything they served under Delta, they are keeping. So there must be differences in their contract with United versus Delta that allows them to make those changes, and it make more sense to do that, or some other reasons. I don't know. But, so basically in the next 90 days, over a quarter of the airports that get essential air service are going to be without an air carrier. Now, the way the process actually works is, because it's essential air service and it's regulated, you can't stop service. You can give a 90-day notice, but the DOT will issue it's called a hold-in order at 30-day increments that basically say you must continue service until a replacement carrier is found. So there's not necessarily going to be loss of service from no planes are flying, but expect that all of these will need a new carrier sooner rather than later. Now, we know from what I said earlier that Cape Air has got pilot issues. One of the other items on here is Boutique, who's another Cape Air-esque carrier, has given notice of most of the airports they serve that they're going to pull out. A little bit different scenario. For them, it's pilot shortage is a reason, but the overall reason is that with inflation, fuel prices, and having to pay more for pilots, they are losing too much money in these contracts. So they are pulling out, basically ending their contract early, but they intend to rebid on those at a higher rate so that they're sustainable as a company going forward. But pilot issues are a factor in that. So SkyWest doesn't have the pilots, Boutique is having challenges, Cape Air is having challenges with pilots. Where, in the scheme of things, are aircraft companies and pilots going to come that are now going to start service on 29 airports? It's going to be chaos in EAS for the next 6 months as this kind of sorts itself out. It probably means that creative solutions, not unlike maybe what we had previously with public charters, are going to need to get adopted more to fill this huge gap. But it's creating chaos. So SkyWest gave notice on the 9th. On the 10th, and I suspect DOT was given a heads up because there's no way they could get this out in a day. But on the 10th, they released an RFP for new service at all 29 of those airports. So in the next 30 days, they're waiting for bidders to bid on those airports. As I mentioned, I talked to Cape Air this morning, and some of those dots are cities that Cape Air used to serve. They're not necessarily looking at bidding on any of them because they're already stretched their capacity. So if Cape Air, who's probably the second largest EAS carrier, isn't able to step in, what does that mean for the industry? Now, does it mean that SkyWest will come in and bid under Delta? They've got different pilot arrangements with Delta. I don't know. I mean, there may be something like that for some of these markets, but I don't know where this is going. And DOT has still not released the RFP for Manistee. Now, given that these 29 airports theoretically are without service in 90 days, and our contract ends in, still 6 months from now, obviously the priority is on those airports. But I really, at this point, would probably predict that ours is gonna get delayed and not come out in March as I had otherwise thought it would, which is more of a typical timeline, and we might be delayed a couple months as they're just kind of dealing with trying to sort this out. When it comes around to ours coming out, we will then be just after this all happened, who's gonna be left to bid on us? I'm nervous that Cape Air, because they've struggled here, and, part of the reason they've struggled is we're a little bit outside of their typical model because we're like an extra hop away from their main base of maintenance, which is St. Louis. Yes, they do serve into O'Hare from other markets, but it is harder for them to provide the backup that they do when you're only one hop away from their main regional airport as opposed to 2 hops away. However, there are some indications that they're pursuing things that could be of benefit to us. So, this is a bit of a segue, but it's important. So, Cadillac Aircraft Service does maintenance for Cape Air. They also maintain pretty much all the aircraft that are housed here. But they're in Cadillac, and they're over here now probably 2-3 days a week, doing, some maintenance on an aircraft. But, there's a lead time in getting them here, so if, morning flight, supposed to go at 7:30, there's an issue, and the spare aircraft, if there's an issue with that, well, then they've got to get a mechanic out here and troubleshoot, and it all takes time, especially when they're away. Cape Air Maintenance has approached Cadillac Aircraft Service and said, we'd really like you to have someone in Manistee full-time. And to make that happen, we'll move other aircraft maintenance up to Manistee so that you've got stuff to do full-time for Cape Air. That would be great. We'd essentially then have on-field maintenance every day, and Cape Air would be driving what makes it happen. Cape Air would do that because it provides the level of service that they want to be providing, and, it would be good for the airport because we now have another business essentially operating here from an economic development standpoint. It makes us a more viable small GA airport. So things like that, the fact that Cape Air is pursuing that, I think speaks that they haven't written Manistee off, because that's my fear right now, is that we've been too difficult for Cape Air and they won't want to rebid because they can bid on an airport that SkyWest is dropping out of St. Louis, and it would be much easier to reallocate those resources to something nearer and easier to provide service for. But the fact that they're pursuing these things, give me hope that they haven't written us off, and that we should hopefully at least have them rebid on us. No guarantees though at this point, and we'll see what happens. But so therefore, it is possible that come June, our RFP comes back and no one bids on us. Cape Air will then be obligated to continue service because that's the way the process works. But the whole world has changed in the last 2 weeks. And part of the change, so out of conference, I was so excited because I spent a good deal of time talking to the airport manager at Ironwood. They, as of October 1st, had started service with a carrier called Denver Air Connection, which operates 50-seat regional jets with United Coach, United Interlines into O'Hare, and for them also Minneapolis. And the manager couldn't say better things about how well they performed, and everything about how they were doing was great. That was coming off of their stint with Boutique, who was everything the opposite of that. Every single commitment that Boutique promised, they didn't come through on, and didn't want to fly, didn't have pilots, canceled left and right. But Denver Air Connection was providing stellar service. I'm thinking this would be really a good potential opportunity, especially as we struggle with our summer demand. But if you look again at the SkyWest dot, there's like 10 dots around Denver. It makes no sense for them to be bidding on us way out here, 3-hour flight from where their aircraft are based and maintained, when they've got ample opportunity to use every aircraft, every pilot they have in their own backyard. But that doesn't mean that those opportunities won't come again sometime in the future. It's just not likely, I think, this go-round for us. So that's kind of the status of EAS happening right now at a national level, primarily driven by this pilot shortage that's been in the making for 10 years. And COVID initially gave us a reprieve, in fact, did the opposite. But now that flying has basically ramped up to pre-COVID levels for everything except international travel, that shortage is just, it's there and it's real.
Would it be wrong for me to assume the reason why these are getting, the EAS are getting, is because they're locked in on contracts that are no longer profitable because of fuel prices and pilot demands for additional pay?
Well, in general, there's a hierarchy in the pilot world where, a senior captain of United is making very good compensation. A senior at a regional, not so much, and, someone that's in a feeder like Cape Air.
Cutting their teeth.
Yes. So what's happening is, and the shortage is occurring at that top level. There's a whole history around mandatory retirement age and that getting waived, that there's way more pilots retiring at the major carriers than there is new pilots being created in today's environment. So there's basically, everything's just shifting up. So someone like SkyWest is basically hiring every pilot they can from a Cape Air as soon as they've got enough hours that they could fly at a regional. They want more money, and they're not, there are lots of reasons people make decisions about where they work and, where they reside, and it's not always driven by money, but often it is. So it's just kind of this sucking up that chain that's occurring right now, and there's no end in sight, and there aren't enough pilots being trained to fill that pipeline. And then there are regulatory issues around how many hours you even need to start at certain levels that make it, it's a $150,000 investment if it's on your dime to actually get the time in so that you can even be hired. There's just so many other factors that would make it, why would I want to be a pilot if I have to deal with all of this to get my foot in the door? And yes, down the road, it may make sense, but, you know, many people just don't want to deal with that.
Yeah.
Almost similar to being a doctor, you know, is the cost worth it for medical school and residency and all of that to then maybe, you know, have a decent life later on? Some people it is, for some people it is.
Feeling over in Cadillac, the service, coming over here. I forget the guy's name over there,
Joe Sprague?
Joe, yeah.
I mean, right now, he's thinking of basically doing both. He has 2 additional employees right now, so they're rotating in here.
Okay.
But he'd be looking at hiring someone probably full-time that would be based here.
So that's another thing, those A&P mechanics aren't growing on trees either.
Correct, correct.
So do we need to provide a space for them somehow over here to?
So we've got the hangar that we are now leasing to Cape Air. Joe has actually been, he and I have been talking for years on him owning that hangar or leasing that hangar. It's a bare bones hangar, doesn't have heat. He actually wants to install heat in it right now, and I said, if I were in your shoes, I'd wait to see if Cape Air is gonna have a contract more than 6 months out before I'd be investing your dollars in making improvements in something, assuming something's gonna happen. But that would be where he would start.
Okay, that seems reasonable. Oh, that'd be great.
Is there, so I feel like the question we need to ask, because there's all kinds of things happening that make us nervous but are way outside of our sphere of control.
Yep.
So then, like, where can we spend our energy? I think the question we need to be working on is, how do we de-risk the chance of a no bid, right?
Yep.
Like fundamentally that, so I'd be curious to know.
So my thoughts on that are, we need Cape Air to bid on us. They're a known quantity, and have they had challenges? Yes. Do I believe, for the most part, that most of those challenges are behind them? I believe it. If that's accurate or not, time will tell. And so therefore, it's, you know, making sure that we are attractive to them. And, you know, I was on the phone with them this morning, and, you know, I talk with them monthly, and was really trying to gauge their, you know, so one of the questions I asked, are you planning on bidding on all of these? Because if you do, I'm concerned that you're not gonna have resources left for Manistee when that bid comes around. And the answer I got was, we don't intend to because we can't. So that made me feel better, but, you know, how much there is that we can do, you know, versus not, I don't know.
So like, one of the things we may wanna do is actually lean into their desire to have Joe have someone here full-time. They're not in a position to tell us if they're gonna rebid or whatever else for Cape Air, then, but maybe Joe could say, hey, listen, I'd love to do that, but I can't do it unless I know a year from now that me spending all this, bringing this guy in, is gonna be worth it.
One thing that I was glad to hear this morning is, so I had the conversation with Joe. He's obviously working with their maintenance department. I wasn't sure whether their maintenance department was making the rest of the company fully aware of what they were proposing or thinking. But after talking with Andrew, he was fully aware that this was going on, which actually made me feel very good that person in the position of planning knew of these things that were going on and wasn't saying, no, you shouldn't do that because we're not gonna bid, so why would you waste time on that? So, I was happy to hear some of those answers that I got this morning.
I don't know, I still think it might be interesting to go back, I know you just got done talking to Joe, but maybe we can use him a little bit. So if he's able to communicate, I want to invest in putting in heat, I'm willing to bring someone here full-time, are you willing to invest back in me? He might be able to get feedback we aren't able to get. Or maybe that's another driving factor. hey, are we gonna rebid in Manistee? Well, yeah, they've committed to us that if we do, they'll have someone there full-time,
Mhm.
and they're gonna make their guy really comfy by putting in heat, so he's not gonna wanna quit.
Yep,
You know,
Yep.
those things work, it's the little stuff.
yep, no, I like how you think of it from that perspective.
Mhm.
I haven't yet
Mhm.
had the time to separate myself enough to.
Well, that's
think
why
about
we're
it
all
from
here, right, to
that
share ideas?
perspective. Yeah, no, I
We're on
appreciate
the
that,
lead.
so I will doodle on that in my interactions, try to figure out how that makes sense. Any other thoughts or comments? This is my last slide, so it's the last of my, my news.
If our RFP is delayed, then we just will the period, like the response time be delayed as well? Or do we just get into that, if Cape Air doesn't bid, then the 30-day thing? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we worked to get the extension to start on the state and county fiscal year as well. As we start October 1, that's when our contract will, our contract will expire September 30th.
Correct.
So actually, yeah, if it was, 2 years ago, normally we would have been working on it right now, but because of that extension, it'd probably be a couple of months push yet anyway, I would assume. Somewhere in there.
DOT's typical timeline is to do it 6 months in advance, because if there ends up being a change in carrier, normally it's about a 90-day process,
Mm.
but then that gives that new carrier 90 days to actually get everything ready to start service.
Mhm.
Because, getting a contract awarded and then needing to start service, 30 days later doesn't happen. It's just equipment and everything you need logistically to make it happen doesn't happen that quickly. So that's typically why they like to do a 30 days
Mhm.
or a
Mhm.
6 months.
They were still with our previous carrier though, and something like this happened. They were basically just going belly up, so how does the 30-day hold happen in that case? if
that
someone's
is-
just going, I'm out of business.
So, since I've been in this position, there have been 2 times where we've had no service. And both of those were because the carrier just basically either couldn't or wouldn't continue service even though they were ordered to. Generally, someone like SkyWest, them ignoring a directive from DOT is less likely just because they've so many interactions. They're not going out of business. But, we've had scenarios where the company their plan was to stop flying. So therefore, how do you force somebody to fly safely when their plan is to no longer operate? SkyWest is a continuing, ongoing concern, as is Cape Air. So I think that's the benefit of us being with, Cape Air, which is a larger company, is they're not going to, stop because they're too vested in, their operations to fall into that trap. But yeah, someone like Public Charters, if they went bankrupt, there's nothing you could do to force them to continue.
So I guess where my concern is right now the concern is get somebody to bid. But what if some fly-by-night operation comes in and they're low bid and DOT says that's who we want you to go with, and then they go belly up, then where are we?
That's a possibility.
That's a good question. Like, is the stability of
Right.
of the
Now-
airline taken into consideration?
Yes, generally,
They take our recommendation and
DOT will look and place a lot of weight on the community's recommendation if there are multiple bids. There is, though, it tends to, I don't know, I can't necessarily say there's a strict pattern to it, but if the community's request is for a bid that's significantly more expensive than the low bid, or another bid that's considered equally, good. They won't necessarily always take the communities, but those things like reliability and ability to actually execute do come into play, and the DOT will generally follow
I'm just
what
concerned.
makes the most sense.
I get that, I'm
But
just concerned, there's somebody
getting-
sees this as an
it could be-
opportunity,
Yes,
and some fly-by-night guy, I can't remember the guy's name, whoever we had before,
yep.
goes, all right, well, I'm gonna start this business, and he ends up being our only bid.
Right.
Do we have to go down that route?
There are a lot of factors that protect us in that, because it's incredibly difficult to be a new entrant in this space. When we went down the path of working with public charters, we basically the only way they could have come in was if we wanted them, because they didn't meet basic requirements otherwise, because they were new. So, there's always corner cases where the scenario you're talking about is possible. It's unlikely, but I would say, and again, some of this is based on what I learned in my communication with the Ironwood manager, is in our last cycle, Boutique and Cape Air both bid, and from our scoring, they were relatively close. But from what I hear, there's a night and day difference into business culture and, just honesty and being able to follow through on commitments between those two carriers, and we definitely made the right choice. Those are the ones where I think it's a little more hard, where they look good on paper, and you don't know until after the fact that not. But something like someone not being in business, so, for very long, that's pretty blatant, that we.
I'm just wondering that there's gonna be kinda like the Boutique Air guys who were kinda like venture capitalists. And if there's somebody else like that that's gonna see this as an opportunity and go, well, I can get in on that, and then they see that as a risk, because as you just pointed out, Cape Air does this for a living. The other two guys that came in from Boutique were venture capitalists, more or less, and they're not really in this for flying, they're in this because they saw an opportunity.
Right. Yep.
I apologize, I got a 2:00 meeting. Jeff looks excited, so he wants to keep staying here.
Okay, that's the end of my report.
Old or unfinished business?
Nothing
Nothing's
that I'm
listed.
aware of.
Good. Then
Yeah.
we're set to new business. And A is fees and rates.
Okay, so also something that I hand out is, we don't necessarily need to take action on this month, but again, I was anticipating that potentially our RFP might come out, and generally there's a 30-day, window for carriers to respond. I think we might be a little bit farther out than that. But one of the things carriers need is, as they're putting together their bid, how much is this gonna cost to operate here? And our fees play into that. So I put together a list of all of the fees that we have established, and basically, we need to be thinking about how much we want to increase them. And that's really hard right now in this environment, because with inflation spiking and labor costs spiking, if you think about our revenue sources broadly, half of our revenues comes from fees we charge to the airline. 25% comes from what we get allocated from the county. And the other 25% is hangar rent, car rental fees, just kind of the everything else. fuel. So we, if we are anticipating that our costs are gonna rise, let's say we're gonna enter a 2-year agreement, and we're locking in 50% of our revenue at a certain rate, that's gonna have impact on how much either we need from the county or how much we need from other sources, or a general fund that is not flush to tide us through things. So we need to figure out how we want to do this. In the past, recent past, it's been fairly easy because inflation and costs were kind of under control. So we've generally, for the last 7 years, probably just been doing a 3% per year increase. That may not be the right amount this go around. And some of these things like hangar rentals, that $150, that's been that rate for 15 years. That hasn't been updated. Now, the condition of what you're renting has also decreased over the last 15 years. So, but the new hangars, which are now about 10 years old, are still at the same rate that they were 10 years ago. So there's an overall just review of this, and I don't know if we're nearing 2 hours in this meeting, so we're probably past the mental capacity to be thinking about this. There's a budget committee meeting that's to be scheduled, and maybe that's where this starts, is at that committee level, bringing it back to the board next month.
Good place to go with it.
That historically, we've increased 3% a year on some of these, but
Generally, the things,
0% on others?
yes. So generally, the things that are to the airline, so their landing fees, that last one, air carrier, Part 139 services fee, and terminal lease rates, we've been kind of indexing 3% a year for inflation. The last time we did this, the fuel flow fee increased from 15 cents a gallon to 16 cents a gallon, but that was the first time we'd upped that in memory.
When was the last time we did this?
2 years ago was the last time we made changes. And again, that corresponded to the EAS contract 2 years ago.
Do we have intel on what other airports charge?
We are probably the most expensive airport to operate into. We charge more to our airline than basically anybody else does.
In reality, the county should allocate more resources to catch it, squeezing that blood out of the rock.
Yeah.
So my predecessor, prior to 2004 or 5, we were not a Part 139 airport. As Part 139, we have to have fire, there's a whole set of regulatory requirements that we are obligated to. Before that, we didn't have any of that, so it was just basically a bunch of part-time people that were here fueling and snow plowing, and that was it. So the cost structures radically changed from people who need to be trained and certified to do
I
things
gotcha. Okay.
versus part-time people. So at that time, my predecessor approached DOT and said, well, since we're Essential Air Service, can we just pass these costs on to the airline and have them build it into their cost to operate? And DOT said yes. So we have taken the approach of, it's not the airline's dollars essentially, it's essentially Essential Air Service dollars that are paying these fees, and we're having the luxury that county has dollars that they can then allocate elsewhere. So that's kind of a little bit of the history as to how we've become the Air Force to operate.
Honor, I'm sure.
Yeah.
What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
Yeah. So shall we then, refer this to Budget Committee and move on? Then, new business item B.
So then the last thing is, you should have had a copy. This is
Mhm.
what George Saylor put together the last time. It's basically just a template for car rental concessionaire agreement.
Mhm.
I would just request that the board authorize me to execute this document with our new car rental firm, once all the details, have been put.
So moved.
Second?
Moved and seconded. Discussion? See anything in here that you think needs adjustment or changing?
No.
Okay.
Terry, will you need another resolution like you did last time?
No,
Okay.
that's only for state grant things, this.
I was just confused on that because I was like, I have never even heard of that, so, cool,
Yeah, it's
thank you.
like once or twice a year on
Okay,
certain things.
good to know. Cool, thank you.
Moved and seconded to authorize Mr. Lind to enter the contract for car rentals. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed? Motion passes. Brings us to item 11. Any comments by anyone who's still here and awake?
And sorry, I knew this was gonna be a long meeting, and telling people who I was talking to, it was going to be 2 hours, and I actually
Yeah.
did pretty good on that, so.
Yeah.
The coffee machine was a killer. I even brought
Yes,
my
I
airport
know, I
cup.
know, I went to get a cup of coffee before the meeting, it's like, what do you mean it's spewing beans?
I would have usually consumed this whole thing, died by now, but I knew to save, so. Well, thank you all for your, endurance, I guess.
Sure.
And, a lot of stuff to go over. I'm glad we did it, and, being no further business, meeting adjourned.
Interesting.